Here's something off the request line from Liberty Island.
Mr. Blair says he wants to lead in Europe. But the price of that is that he's expected to lead Britain by the nose into the single currency. And he's prepared to do it. I would never be prepared to give up our own currency. When people are free to choose, they choose freedom.
Early in the morning on the 2nd of May 1997, John Major came to Conservative headquarters to greet party workers. He had just led his party to its worst election defeat ever. Amidst the smiles and commiseration, many blamed him for the defeat and thought his weak leadership was the cause of the disaster. But he led a divided party, and the dilemma he always faced was how to make peace between the warring factions. It was a problem he never solved.
I went into central office wondering how they felt after this catastrophic defeat. I thought then, and thought many times thereafter, what differently could I have done? Would it have made a difference? Would we have won? Would we have minimized the defeat? Were there other options that we could have taken? That runs round in your mind for quite a long time as you reconsider the decisions you took and their impact.
In October 1993, John Major went to his party's annual conference in Blackpool with his wife Norma. After the government's disastrous record of the previous year, he wanted to make a fresh start and impose his leadership on the party. Divisions over Europe were to be put aside, fences mended with old foes, and a new policy set out to unite both left and right. But it was not to be. Within weeks, the rancorous civil war in the party would break out again, and the bastards, as the Prime Minister had called some of his colleagues when he thought the microphones were off, would be back.
It's always a good idea to find out if these are on.
The fresh start was dubbed Back to Basics, and it would be yet another calamity in the catalogue of disasters that beset his premiership.
It is time to return to those old core values. Time to get back to basics, to self-discipline and respect for the law.
It was never, from me, a question of individual morality, and I would have shied away from that. It was tied to feelings about single mothers. Hardly likely I'd do that. Norma's mother brought up Norma as a single mother. My sister brought up her children as a single mother. Hardly likely that I would engage in that sort of morality crusade, and nor did I.
But that's just how the press saw it, a moral crusade. With the encouragement from some of the Prime Minister's colleagues on the right, the issue was made one of personal conduct and triggered a succession of salacious stories about Tory ministers.
Well, I think he might have remembered that a number of members of his cabinet had mistresses, girlfriends, perhaps boyfriends. At least one other family somewhere else. But there were quite a lot of junior ministers that had all sorts of liaisons. Several had fathered illegitimate children. Some they supported, some they didn't. It was not a very salubrious bunch in a way.
The Conservative Party didn't invent sex in the 1990s. It was there a long time before. It didn't invent misbehaviour in the 1990s. That was there before. Where I think the media had some justification for the way they behaved is that some of our colleagues did make speeches which seemed to be a morality crusade against single mothers and others. I told them to stop that, but by then, of course, the genie was out.
What
what I think the media saw in Back to Basics was a wonderful opportunity to shove the knife in deeper and kill this government with 1,000 cuts. And therefore it embarked upon a search of the bedrooms of Westminster and Whitehall and whatnot, and found all sorts of obscure Tories in the wrong bed or whatever. It even found one in France, a most obscure MP whose name I still can't remember. They found him there with a chap.
Every Saturday night, at least it seemed like every Saturday night, I'd be sitting here at home, and about 8 o'clock the telephone would go, and my Tim Collins, my head of communications at Central Office, would ring up and say, "Chairman, there's this interesting story going in tomorrow in the News of the World or the People or wherever it happened to be," and another story would come through.
As the revelations continued, Back to Basics was quietly dropped. But John Major's government was further damaged, and a new word, sleaze, became commonplace, used to cover both the sexual and financial wrongdoings of MPs.
The sexual things, which were usually matters of absolutely trivial unimportance to the general public outside the family of the person concerned, helped build up this picture of sleaze, and sleaze played a big part in bringing the government down.
Ever since the calamity of Black Wednesday, John Major's leadership had been in a state of near-permanent crisis. His standing in the party, especially on the right, had fallen, and there was frequent talk of a leadership challenge.
It was becoming a sort of regular autumn event, rather like the first cuckoo in spring. The first reporting of a potential challenge in the autumn was one I was getting used to. It had been threatened in '93, and it always appeared whenever there was difficulty, and it always came from the same quarter.
John Major's twice-weekly question times in the House of Commons became an ordeal. It was not so much the opposition, but his own members who questioned his leadership.
I was rather shocked to discover just what disquiet there was with the Prime Minister, and I remember the sort of sotto voce heckling and sharp comments at the expense of the Prime Minister. It was quite extraordinary. It was an awful lot of criticism. The place was in turmoil.
No objective observer believes that this so-called...
The issue was always Europe. For the first time in many years, a sitting Prime Minister was told to go by a member of his own party, a maverick Eurosceptic.
Why doesn't he stand aside and make way for somebody else who can provide the party and the country with direction and leadership? Bring on the white troops!
Whatever you did, you couldn't get off Europe. Whatever action you took, it was unreported. What was reported was yet another European row of one sort, fueling yet another artificial story, yet another artificial division, yet another artificial series of problems, all of which distracted us from the agenda that we had for the whole Parliament.
But one area where John Major was able to set the agenda and provide leadership was Northern Ireland. Within months of becoming Prime Minister, he and colleagues had had a close shave when the IRA mortared Downing Street.
Suddenly I noticed there wasn't any glass between the cabinet room and the garden of number 10. And I thought, funny, I haven't noticed that before. For some reason they'd taken the glass out. And then you heard the noise.
And we got down under the table, and there was a tremendous aftershock. We could hear the windows being blown in, and then the sound of what seemed very much like a second mortar.
Then nobody knew what to do. I mean, what do Englishmen do when they're being mortared in the cabinet room? It wasn't entirely clear.
And I looked around, and there was the cabinet secretary and the rest of the cabinet crouching under the table. And we waited there a moment until the aftershock went away. We got up, asked the people to go and check to see what damage was done, and I then said, well, I think we better go and start somewhere else.
Since coming to office, the Prime Minister had been determined to make progress in bringing peace to the troubled province. On this issue at least, he had the support of the vast majority of Parliament.
Go back up the street, it is not safe. Move.
the whole of my adult life, I remembered the same headlines that people barely noticed. Another soldier killed, another civilian murdered, another teenager beaten up. And people almost had got themselves in a mood where they accepted it. Northern Ireland was different, and therefore it rolled on and we moved on to the next item of news. Well, I didn't think that was right. I thought that would be utterly unacceptable if it was in Surrey or Northumberland. Cannot be acceptable in Northern Ireland. Let's see what can be done about it.
For some time, the Prime Minister had been kept informed of a secret link between the IRA and the British government, by which information between the warring parties could be exchanged.
We had never negotiated with the IRA, and nobody on our behalf had been authorised to negotiate with the IRA at all. The purpose of the link was to have a means by which any communication could be sent to us by the IRA, so that, and indeed so that each side could know what the position of the other was.
Late in February 1993, Downing Street received a message through the link, apparently from the IRA. It was passed immediately to the Prime Minister.
It was a very startling message indeed. It said, the conflict is over, but we need your help to bring it to a close, and then expanded upon that thought. And we were in no doubt, after making inquiries, that that had come from members of the Provisional Army Council. And so it was a clear indication, the first one that we had had, from Sinn Féin IRA, that they might actually be looking seriously at whether there could be a dialogue that would lead to a permanent ceasefire.
The message, later denied by the IRA, gave the impetus John Major needed for further talks with Dublin and all the parties in Northern Ireland. His aim was a set of principles which could underpin a full-scale peace settlement and be the basis of an Anglo-Irish declaration.
Everybody was suspicious of everybody else. And so the trick was to produce a declaration that produced a whole stream of principles that upon these key points and others would reassure the Unionists, the Nationalists, and bring in the paramilitaries to see that there was a reason to turn to a democratic approach.
As the negotiations continued, so did the violence. On the 23rd of October 1993, an IRA bomb exploded in a fish shop in the Shankill Road, killing 10. Although Sinn Féin, the political wing of the IRA, were not talking directly to John Major, they were building contacts with the British government. The temptation, in the wake of the atrocity, was to end all dialogue. When Gerry Adams, Sinn Féin's leader, was seen carrying the coffin of the Shankill bomber, killed by his own device, the temptation was all the greater.
John phoned me up and he said, look, we're going to have to close down this whole process. He said, yeah, I can appreciate that. But I want you to understand that if Gerry Adams didn't carry that coffin, it wouldn't be any use to you or I. He couldn't deliver.
At one stage I caught him by the lapels and I said, Prime Minister, don't forget that Gladstone failed, that Lloyd George failed, that Churchill failed, and that the Prime Minister who brings peace to Ireland will go down in history more than the Prime Minister who puts VAT on fuel.
John Major agreed. The negotiations continued despite the violence and led to the first Anglo-Irish declaration of common principles at Downing Street. The way was open for further talks. 8 months later, the IRA called a ceasefire, which was to last for a year and a half. The declaration was, at the very least, a step forward.
The Taoiseach and I have now agreed on a joint declaration on Northern Ireland. It is a declaration for democracy and dialogue, and it is based on consent. It makes no compromise on strongly held principles.
The problem of Northern Ireland had brought out what many saw as the best in John Major's leadership, and shown his ability to negotiate and reach consensus. But his authority depended on the consent of Parliament. With the Irish question, he had the backing of the vast majority of MPs. On other matters, he clearly did not.
Margaret Thatcher had always had much bigger majorities in Parliament. And the tragedy of the 1992-1997 Parliament was we scarcely had any majority, so that every rebellion mattered, and the rebellion was thereby encouraged and got worse and worse and worse.
A group of Eurosceptic rebels had come to national prominence. They joined together to oppose the Maastricht Bill and campaigned against Europe ever since. With the backing of the Conservative press, they made the Prime Minister's management of the party almost impossible.
Every time the Eurosceptics scratched their political sores in public, we became more unpopular. You had a relatively small, at that time, number of Conservative backbenchers who had done deals with the Labour Party, who were absolutely unbiddable on any subject to do with Europe. If it was European, it seemed to them to be wrong.
In November 1994, 8 Eurosceptics rebelled against a bill to make extra government payments to Brussels. John Major won the vote, but in a show of strength, he threw the rebels out of the party.
John Major was so hopping mad, and I think he thought again that his authority was being undermined, that he ordered the chief whip to go ahead with removing the whip from us, which is a bit like losing your work ticket. I woke up next morning and thought, well, what happens to me now? You know, do I go down the labour exchange with my P45 and register as unemployed?
She did nothing of the sort, and the removal of the whip made the rebels the focus of yet more media attention. To be whipless meant that you were expelled from the Conservative Parliamentary Party, but remained an MP. The expulsion wiped out John Major's majority. Many of his colleagues were uneasy at the move.
I would not have taken the whip away from the rebels, because however unsatisfactory the position was, that actually made it even more unsatisfactory, because it made the people martyrs who the whip was taken away from. I don't think that was a piece of sensible politics, but obviously there was a degree of frustration about what was taking place.
They were in very great demand. College Green was permanently booked. You never quite knew which of them would be appearing on television doing interviews, but you could be fairly certain someone would. There was nothing I could have done about that. I could do nothing about their behaviour before they lost their whip. That was self-evident, for they had continued to cause the government difficulties. And of course, when they didn't have the whip, I could do even less about it.
I've got a meeting at 3:30, and I need a cup of coffee.
Those kind of political loonies are people who, the more they're on the television and the radio, the more they think they're very, very important. And it begins to be circular, because they get on the television and radio because they are important in that they hold the swing, whereupon they think they're very important. They think their views are very important. And they've come to the conclusion that they're really running the country. And after a bit, they get quite near to doing so.
For the rebels, it was political fulfillment at last.
There was a wonderful feeling of achievement, because, you know, for years and years we had just been a small group of rebels, and here we were, the balance of power, and being able to decide things. We used to have a weekly meeting in the House of Commons. It was good. And we used to change the chairman every week meeting to make sure that nobody was in charge. We used to have nice cups of coffee and sometimes chocolates when things were going well, and say, well, who's the Prime Minister this week? Yes, it'll be maybe Theresa Prime Minister this week, and we'd sit round and have a discussion. What are we going to do? And we used to consider the government's business and say, well, how will we vote?
Well, we like the idea of a free trade area with Europe, but that's all we want.
The whipless MPs were able to do real damage to John Major's policies. In December that year, they successfully defeated an increase of VAT on fuel. Faced with an unworkable situation in Parliament and ridiculed in the press for weak leadership, John Major decided that the time had come to invite the rebels back. In April 1995, after 5 months in the wilderness, the whipless MPs were told that they could return to the party without condition or penalty.
We were simply sent a letter to say, from now on, you will receive the whip again unless you write to us and tell us you don't want to, which was the most extraordinary letter. And lo and behold, we were back on the register, so to speak.
John Major had expected the whipless MPs to return to the fold humbled and in good order. They did not. Instead, they gave a press conference in which they refused to make a single concession.
There is going to be no going back on what we fought for over the past 5 months.
We have been proved right because public opinion has been undoubtedly on our side.
I think the way they behaved when they came back was outrageous. I should, in retrospect, have imposed conditions, even though that would have humiliated them. I chose not to do so because I wished to bring them back in a mood that would encourage them to be supportive, and then they were not. So you may say I was gullible and I was foolish, and I could scarcely disagree with that judgment. And it was unsurprising afterwards that so many people were angry with me.
By allowing the rebels back without condition, the Prime Minister did himself much damage. There was a feeling that too often he made a stand, only to back down later. The cabinet, like the party, was split on the European question. On one side, Kenneth Clarke, the Chancellor, constantly urged John Major to give no quarter to the Eurosceptics. On the other, Michael Portillo, a right-winger, maintained that he simply wanted leadership.
On one occasion, room alone with John Major, and typically if you were in that situation you would sit next to the Prime Minister. He'd make a point of calling you over to his side of the table. I said to him in a very gentle tone, I said, Prime Minister, you know, we are so deeply divided on this European question. Half the cabinet says one thing, the other half says the other. I really think that rather than trying to ride these two horses, you would do much better to decide what your line is going to be and get rid of the half of the cabinet that disagrees with whatever you've decided upon. And if you get rid of the half of the cabinet that includes me, you will never hear me complain, because I think it's the right thing for you to do. I will never complain that you've done that. And John Major typically smiled and was very charming, and he reached out his hand and put it on my arm and said, "Oh no, Michael, I never want to sack you." And to me it was so frustrating because, although it was very charming, it was completely to miss the point. I thought I was making a serious point. I really thought it was better for him to act decisively and have a cabinet around him of people who agreed with a clear-cut policy than to struggle on with these two halves fighting against each other.
I sat in the middle, and both the pro-Europeans and the anti-Europeans found that uncomfortable. It may be my tragedy that I sat in the middle of the party with two highly committed wings, one pro-European and one anti-European, both of them disappointed that I wasn't going to move wholly to their camp.
With a divided cabinet, John Major lost confidence in many of his colleagues. Increasingly, he discussed important decisions outside cabinet with a trusted inner circle.
The cabinet became an unhealthy place after the early years of the Major government, when it had been a delight to be in it, because it had been secure and cohesive and rallied behind John to deliver what he wanted to deliver. Eventually, the cabinet became leaky as a sieve, and no minister wished to raise any serious business there. The cabinet secretary became concerned that ministers would not bring their business to cabinet.
The leaks were a darn nuisance. The suspicion was that it was John Redwood, but I couldn't be certain of that. Several of my senior colleagues had said to me that they were very concerned about the amount of leaking. They felt that John may be responsible simply because a number of the leaks came from meetings that he had attended, but they didn't know any more than I did.
Well, you say that the Prime Minister felt frustrated that there were press leaks and press briefings about policy. That was not something I ever did. I always followed one very simple rule, which is that I expressed my views as clearly and as strongly as I could within the privacy of Cabinet and Cabinet subcommittee meetings. And I did not tell the press what my view was, unless my view then became the general view, in which case I could express it because it was the official policy of the government.
With the breakdown of cabinet government and the fiasco of the whipless rebels, the future of the Prime Minister became a matter for open speculation. John Major himself was convinced that a leadership challenge in November was a certainty. On a June evening in 1995, the Prime Minister confronted his critics at a meeting of Eurosceptics in Westminster. It turned into a slanging match about Europe.
I was genuinely embarrassed because people were so rude to him in that room, and I afterwards remonstrated with one or two of them. I said, you should not treat the Prime Minister like this. He is the Prime Minister, whatever you think, and you should not speak to him in front of other people like that.
Some of their points, I think, went beyond the normal courtesies of exchanges between colleagues. They were pretty rough. I responded pretty angrily myself to the way in which some of the points were put.
When he left, there was just perfunctory applause. He struck me very much then as being the stag at bay. And certainly that was a turning point in the estimation of many people of John Major.
2 days later, on June the 15th, the Prime Minister attended a summit in Canada, leaving behind a party which seemed no more than an argumentative rabble. A throwaway comment picked up by microphones only served to highlight his woes.
How can I say that? I am a coalition government. I am a coalition government on my own health.
On his return from Canada that weekend, the Prime Minister realized he had to do something to restore his authority and prevent a leadership challenge in November.
I began to see the sheer horror of carrying on this way for another 4 months. For the previous 2 or 3 years, we had had threats of a challenge to the leadership. So the thought began to grow upon me that I should bring the contest forward and create a contest myself by resigning. I discussed it when I got home with Norma and the children, and walking round the garden at the Finings on the Sunday, I finally made up my mind that that is what I would go for.
Late in the evening on the following Wednesday, John Major had a secret meeting with Lord Cranborne, the leader of the House of Lords. He asked him to be his campaign manager. Cranborne agreed, despite misgivings about the Prime Minister's plan.
What worried me was that I thought it was actually not an expression of strength, but an expression of weakness. And an admission that things were very bad. Well, we all knew things were very bad, but maybe you could have strengthened your position by not admitting it and by a rather more powerful putsch or two inside the Tory party.
Major's coming now. Can you hear me? Major's coming. Are you recording? Major's coming. I've lost all sound. Are you?
But the Prime Minister's mind was made up. On the 22nd of June 1995, he strode into the Downing Street garden to make his surprise announcement.
The purpose was quite clear. I would either win, in which case we had a sporting chance, no certainty, a sporting chance of the party behaving itself over Europe as we approached the election, or I would lose.
I am not prepared to see the party I care for laid out on the rack like this for any longer. To remove this uncertainty, I have this afternoon tendered my resignation as leader of the Conservative Party.
I chaired. I thought it was absolutely the right thing to do. I thought that was John at his best. That was John decisive, taking control of events, refusing to be buffeted by them.
The Conservative Party must make its choice. Every leader is leader only with the support of his party.
I thought he was mad.
That is true.
He wants to continue to be Prime Minister. What for? What's he trying to achieve? What is this extremely nice, gentle, malleable personality trying to do?
In short, it is time to put up or shut up. I have nothing more to say this afternoon. Thank you very much.
At the time, a number of people wrote that if I could keep my fingers clinging onto the doorknob of number 10 Downing Street, I would. That couldn't have been more wrong.
Poof, is what I say to that.
My life didn't begin and end with politics, and what was happening was pretty intolerable.
I think he was absolutely determined to stay, as long as he could. I equally think that, paradoxically, he made himself pretty miserable there. And so there was this odd mixture of misery and the limpet, the miserable limpet, if you like, which was a great inhibition to his prime ministership.
All the cabinet rallied round, bar one, John Redwood, the Welsh secretary, who spent the weekend playing cricket and dodging the press. Speculation grew that he was about to stand against the Prime Minister.
Mr. Redwood, sir, are you going to run? No, I told you that I will talk to you on Monday, and I always keep my word, and that's exactly what I will do.
I could not support the leader's decision to resign. I thought it was another mistake, and another mistake that would serve to emphasise weaknesses in the party rather than strengths. It was another diversion from what I thought were the important issues, sorting out taxation, sorting out public services, sorting out the relationship with Europe. And so I spent the weekend genuinely agonising over whether I should resign on the grounds that I could no longer support quite a lot of what the Prime Minister was doing and what he stood for.
It was becoming fairly apparent to me that there was only two possible reasons why John Redwood was unavailable. One, he'd been locked in a bank vault and no one had realised, or secondly, he was out there counting heads. And I assumed he was counting heads.
The following Monday, John Redwood emerged from the relative obscurity of the Welsh office and confirmed the obvious.
I telephoned the Prime Minister this morning and told him I would be resigning. I have now sent him a letter of resignation, which I would like to read to you. Your decision to resign leaves our party in limbo when it needs firm but understanding leadership. It makes a contest inevitable. This weekend...
Well, I was driven by the wish to get some change, and as I made clear throughout my brief but interesting campaign, under the slogan "No change, no chance," I didn't really mind whether it was change of leader or change of policy.
The presence of so many Eurosceptics in a variety of colourful outfits drew the attention of the press.
I was wearing something bright emerald green, and of course his head was framed in that. He was seated in front of me, and the Times made up this gorgeous headline, and it said something like "Vulcan launched from Gorman's bosom," and of course it was hilarious.
It was a tremendous boost to my campaign, and the general impression was described by one of my entourage, I can't remember who it was, as the Barmy Army, a label that stuck.
Film of John Redwood's attempts to sing the Welsh national anthem did further damage.
It was footage that was discovered by a BBC reporter and was played endlessly in years to come. So all those subtleties and the flexibilities of that fine Redwood mind were as naught compared to the kind of political impact of those pictures.
But Redwood's campaign was given an immense boost by a fellow right-wing Eurosceptic, Lady Thatcher, when she gave a speech in Washington.
Is this an endorsement of Mr. Redwood?
Both candidates are sound Conservatives.
I was very surprised when she said that, and I think people took a subliminal message from it.
Next question.
Here was Margaret Thatcher, a Prime Minister who had actually been voted out of office by her fellow members of Parliament, producing a very balanced, equivocal endorsement of her successor, who potentially faced exactly the same difficulty. It was widely interpreted, and I think accurately, as a pretty lukewarm endorsement of me and an encouragement to John Redwood.
Lady Thatcher's preferred candidate for the leadership was the right-wing star, Michael Portillo. But Portillo had offered his backing to the Prime Minister when asked.
Because I had been in his cabinet, whatever disagreements I might have had, I'd remained in the cabinet. I was bound by collective responsibility. I didn't see how I could do anything other than support him. I didn't see how I could be a candidate against him, since I'd been connected with all the policies that were now being debated.
Michael Portillo's supporters did everything they could to persuade him to stand, even installing extra phone lines at a campaign headquarters in Westminster. For a moment or two, Portillo seemed to dither. It was a cause of deep embarrassment.
He's rather proper in his personal relationships. I mean proper in the rather old-fashioned sense. I don't think Michael Portillo would have found it very easy to go out of sight for 3 days and then suddenly declare himself a candidate. He would have had to have warned me in advance, seen me, told me, and then declared himself a candidate.
In the absence of Michael Portillo, most of the Conservative press supported John Redwood. The Daily Mail said of John Major, it was time to ditch the captain. Other papers agreed.
To watch that government staggering on, not believing in itself, it had long ago lost faith in itself, subjecting itself to daily indignity after daily indignity. No, by that stage, and I think most of the Tory press passionately wanted John Major to go.
On July the 4th, 1995, after 10 days of campaigning, Conservative MPs came to the House of Commons to vote. There was a frenzy of media interest in the election, a sign of the vulnerability of the Prime Minister.
Mr. Major, do you still think that
But John Major successfully removed the greatest potential threat. Just before polling, he asked Michael Heseltine to come to Downing Street. He offered him the post of Deputy Prime Minister.
The suggestion was subsequently made by some of the conspiracy theorists that here was a piece of deep, double-dyed, dark cunning on my behalf. I was trying to neutralize Michael so that Michael would not oppose me when I called a leadership election. But that is absurd. No offers were made, no offers were accepted, no deals were done.
I think it is possible for two very sophisticated politicians like John Major and Michael Heseltine to do a deal without actually expressing the words of the deal. I think they understood each other perfectly well. They're both very accomplished politicians in their different ways. And so I think it would have been quite possible for hints to have been dropped and for the necessary steps to have been taken.
Whether or not a deal was done, with Michael Heseltine and his supporters backing, the Prime Minister could be more confident of victory. That afternoon, John Major voted at the House of Commons and returned to Downing Street to wait for the result. A number of close friends and allies were in attendance in the flat upstairs. He needed to win by a large margin if it was to be a convincing victory.
Are you confident, Prime Minister? Clear victory, Prime Minister?
He busied himself once we had all gone up there with pouring everyone a drink, making sure everyone had a seat or somewhere to stand and chatting around and you know, making everyone feel at ease. So whilst, of course, there was a huge amount of tension,
I rather hovered between the door and the sofa and the telephone, because I rather wanted to answer the telephone myself.
Everyone was quite quiet. The phone rang.
We all leapt for it, and I think the first telephone call was from a member of his family, actually, rather than the result, so that was a bit of an anticlimax.
And then the phone rang again, down the corridor, in the little study. John Ward answered it, and came in a few moments later, no expression on his face at all, and handed me a piece of paper. And I looked down at the piece of paper, and it had the result.
He had that same look that I remember from the 1992 election. I mean, the first reaction was not euphoria and delight. It was a very deadpan reaction, and there was that same sort of ashen face.
And the question which only he could decide, and he had to decide quickly, was whether it was enough. And I, after a bit of this, I did say what seemed to me to be accurate. I think it's enough.
Out of possible 329 votes.
John Major had set himself a target of 215 votes. It was a close-run thing.
For John Major, 218. For John Redwood, 89. Abstained, 8. Spoiled, 12. I declare John Major elected.
Everyone thought that was enough. It was, by 3 votes. 4 votes less, and I would have resigned as Prime Minister that evening, and I could not have been persuaded to do otherwise. I had made up my mind, and I would not have been budged on the issue.
Whatever John Major felt, his lieutenants organised a campaign to persuade the media that the result was a triumph for the Prime Minister. His friends invaded College Green and made a beeline for the nearest microphones.
We had made sure that our supporters in the party would communicate very clearly to the press our view of what the figures actually meant. And all the press reporters took on board the same message, accepted it, and it became the authorised version.
I think that some of his friends made a mistake during those moments, because there was a slight tendency to jump up and down and say, marvellous, terrific, whereas actually he knew perfectly well that it wasn't marvellous or terrific.
The Prime Minister lingered upstairs in number 10, reluctant to go out and face the awaiting cameras.
I wasn't ecstatic. I didn't leap around thinking, well, this is wonderful, I've won, I'm now going to be Prime Minister for a good deal longer. So much so that Robert Cranborne, who got rather frustrated and I wasn't going out there, said, your crown is rolling round in the gutter, go out and claim it. And I went out and made a statement saying I hope this was the end of the dispute and we'd now go on to the general election.
We have now seen the verdict of the parliamentary party. Not commentators outside Westminster.
As it turned out, I think what events demonstrate is not that John was mistaken to do it, but the party had gone beyond hope and was not capable of having its divisions healed. There were Eurosceptics living for nothing else but to further the Eurosceptic campaign day by day and to undermine John Major. And a mere setback like the defeat of John Redwood was not going to stop them.
The following autumn, Conservative Party grandees gathered to celebrate Margaret Thatcher's 70th birthday at Claridge's. The leadership election had done nothing to heal old wounds. If anything, it had added poison to the civil war. The row over Europe festered, and the billionaire James Goldsmith now threatened to set up the anti-European referendum party. But above all, behind the public smiles, John Major was inwardly seething at Lady Thatcher. Throughout his time as Prime Minister, he had been unable to resolve the central problem: how to deal with this woman, her constant attacks on his leadership, and the glorification of her legacy by her allies. She, more than any other individual, provoked his bitter resentment.
I found Margaret's behaviour very puzzling. I had no majority. No material majority at all, and yet she seemed to be actively persuading new and relatively impressionable members of Parliament to vote against the government on policy issues. And many of her speeches abroad trickled back here with what could only have been construed as criticism of the government's policy and of my policy. She added an extra piece to her book, which did exactly the same thing. So far as one could tell from all the rumours one heard, and all the information that came to my ears, she was, if not actively encouraging, certainly looking in a very sunny fashion upon James Goldsmith, who was planning to run candidates against the Conservative Party at the next election.
The dilemma the Prime Minister always faced as leader was whether to confront his enemies head-on, and in doing so, risk splitting the party, or to maintain a diplomatic silence. When friends urged him to face up to Mrs. Thatcher, he refused.
Now, I considered on several occasions responding very robustly to what she did. But firstly, I thought that would have just added to the problems in the party at the time and not diminished them. I didn't want to enter into that sort of discourtesy either to someone who had led the Conservative Party for so long. So it was quite difficult to know how to deal with it. And I decided, by and large, one was tempted to brush it to one side. But I was very sorry about it. I was very sad about it. And yes, in retrospect, I suppose I can now say, I think her behaviour was intolerable. And I hope none of my successors are ever treated that way by their predecessors, or indeed by anyone else.
For the next 18 months, until the general election, the popularity of John Major and his government remained dismally low as it stumbled from crisis to crisis. With a vanishing majority, he seemed unable to provide firm leadership. By contrast, Tony Blair, the Labour leader, appeared fresh, assured, and in charge of his party.
No more lies, no more broken promises. I say to the Tories, enough is enough. Be done, be gone.
From now on, New Labour under Tony Blair would make all the running.
People in our party wished to attack the Labour Party on the basis that this was kind of Michael Foot in disguise, a wolf in sheep's clothing, and that really dreadful socialist things were about to happen if you elected Tony Blair. Well, you only had to look at Tony Blair to realise he didn't believe a word of socialism, and he had nothing to do with all that at all. And New Labour was a very attractive product.
But John Major's diagnosis was different.
Now, I know the Labour Party of old. I grew up with it in Lambeth. I've seen it across the House of Commons for a long time. I didn't believe it was a wholehearted conversion. I thought it was a very cunning and potentially very successful marketing ploy by a small number of people at the top of the Labour Party.
Unsurprisingly, an argument broke out in the Conservative Party about how to attack Tony Blair and New Labour. It was a problem which the best advertising minds in the country were unable to answer satisfactorily.
We were, frankly, left flat-footed by the launch of New Labour. We didn't know whether to criticise it for being empty or dangerous, a con trick or superficial candy floss. We didn't know quite what line of attack, and we didn't really arrive at one.
The Major government may not have known how to attack Labour, but it still had much to defend.
I shall, of course, be registering the biscuit in the Register of Members' Interest.
First there had been sexual sleaze. Now several MPs were accused of not registering gifts and taking cash for questions. Neil Hamilton and his wife became a magnet to press and television. Jonathan Aitken, one-time Defence Procurement Minister, was suspected of arms dealing. He was later jailed for perjury. As more scandals came to light, an atmosphere of seediness began to pervade the government.
John Major was absolutely honourable and integrity completely unimpeachable. And yet he seemed almost kind of bewildered by what was happening. You know, he didn't... if he'd absolutely batted into them straight away, it might have been different, but I don't think so. I think he was already running wild by then.
But Europe was always the dominant issue. In March 1996, the Agriculture Minister warned John Major that there could be a link between mad cow disease and human health. The news came out of the blue and led to a European ban on British beef. To the delight of the Eurosceptics, John Major responded by announcing a policy of non-cooperation with Europe until the ban was lifted.
The fact that we then got into headlong conflict with Europe was actually one of the few really bad mistakes that was made. One of the few things, looking back at that government, I feel ashamed of, rather, was that we then turned that crisis, and this was partly because of pressure on our own backbenches, into an anti-European crusade. It wasn't an anti-European crusade. We had a severe problem with dangerous meat.
When the Prime Minister moved against Europe, as he did in the beef crisis, he had to contend with the powerful Chancellor Ken Clarke and his allies in Cabinet.
He consistently, all the way to the end, to the election, believed that we had to give some more ground to the Eurosceptics, which, of course, they were only too eager to take, but it didn't have the slightest effect. To use one of John's favourite phrases, it turned out to be feeding crocodiles. And the great trouble with feeding crocodiles is they'll follow you patiently while you feed them, but you better not run out of buns, because they don't...
But by now there was no way out. John Major's time was up. On the 17th of March 1997, he called a general election to be held 6 weeks later. He headed with his soapbox straight to Luton, in the hope that pictures of his direct appeal to voters would achieve what they had 5 years before, during the previous election campaign. John Major chose to have a long campaign, 6 weeks, in the hope that the feel-good factor, which once won elections, would do so again.
The economy in particular was in better shape than any government had had in the run-up to an election for a very long time. Inflation was low and falling, unemployment was falling, the economy was growing and booming. We were in very fine economic shape indeed, and traditionally good economic shape is the essential underpinning to a successful election campaign.
But it didn't work. After the ERM fiasco of Black Wednesday, voters gave the Prime Minister no credit for the recovery. Instead, attention focused once more on sleaze as the newspapers published revelation after revelation.
Well, in the first 8 days, I think, of the campaign, we'd seen a Conservative backbencher cavorting in a park in the middle of his constituency in broad daylight with a nightclub. We had the chairman of the Scottish Conservative Party who resigned the newspaper allegations, and that was even before the man arrived in town with his white suit, and we then had to cope with the whole Neil Hamilton saga.
Martin Bell, the former BBC journalist, stood against Neil Hamilton on an anti-peace ticket.
I have never accepted any allegations of dishonesty, corruption or impropriety. That is going to be the essence.
After leaks of the Parliamentary Watchdog's report, Hamilton refused to stand down. Many thought John instead of leaving him to make the decision.
An attempt to attack.
I think it was very damaging for the Conservative Party that he made that decision. He had to decide himself. If I had said to him, you mustn't stand, I would have prejudiced his defence, and I would have prejudiced his position in the eyes of the public as a whole.
John Major travelled unceasingly during the campaign. On a single day alone, he visited Northern Ireland, Wales and Scotland, a journey of more than 1,000 miles, to no effect. Discipline had broken down in the party almost completely. More than 300 candidates, 2 of them junior ministers, published their own anti-European manifestos. It was a humiliating snub for the Prime Minister.
I'm afraid that the general view will be a lot of the party behaved monstrously. And in the circumstances, he was proved not to be capable of overwhelming them.
I'm often told it would be a great advantage if I would rule the whole thing out.
The Prime Minister, looking exhausted and depressed, under the watchful eye of Ken Clarke, decided to make a personal appeal to his warring party on the vexed question of the single European currency.
Whether you agree with me or disagree with me, like me or loathe me, don't bind my hands when I am negotiating on behalf of the British nation.
It was a constant problem all the way through that John was trying all the time to accommodate all these views, finding that he was in a bit of a hole in the middle between the 2 points of view.
All Tony Blair had to do was to play safe and avoid any slip-ups. Party strategists warned John Major not to attack the Labour leader for stealing Conservative policies. They felt it only served to endorse him in the eyes of the electorate. Instead, they wanted him to make personal attacks on Tony Blair.
See, I think that John Major could have won the 1997 election. I think he really, really wanted to win it. And if he had been a less pleasant, a less nice person, I think he would have won it.
How can I win?
Conservative Party PR advisers thought they'd come up with a secret weapon. It was broadcast and has never been shown before.
In order to win.
Very powerful. Some people thought it was wrong. I went to see the Prime Minister, which I shouldn't have done in reality, but I did, to appeal to him to run the film.
How can I win? What can I do?
I can show you how to win.
Who are you?
Doesn't matter. I can show you how to win.
We called it the first video, which actually depicted a rather shadowy figure talking to Tony Blair and encouraging him to say anything he needed to say, whether he believed it or not, in order to win the general election.
So you won't put up taxes?
But I will.
So what? Just say it. Go on, it's easy.
I know I'd have to put up taxes.
Just say it. Say it.
I won't put up taxes.
Now say it like you mean it.
I won't. No, I vow. I promise. I pledge.
That's it. Go on.
I pledge not to raise income tax rates for the 5 years of the next Labour government.
What else is there?
A number of people tried to persuade me actually to use the video, but I declined. The essence of Faust is somebody entering into a pact with the devil. That is the essence of the story. And here was the leader of the opposition, patently someone to whom religion was important, depicted in a video as entering such a compact. I thought, firstly, that wasn't something that I wished to do. And secondly, I actually believed that it would backfire and would probably deserve to backfire.
If you're 20 points behind in the polls, you've got to do something, and you've got to do it in the most aggressive and high way that you possibly can. You grasp the agenda. If you don't grasp the agenda, you have lost the battle. And we never, ever grasp the agenda.
As election day approached, John Major ignored his opponents and spoke passionately about his vision of a fairer Britain, and failed to make personal attacks on Tony Blair. It was as if, knowing the election was lost, he was more concerned about posterity than electioneering. The public too seemed aware that his presence on the hustings was no more than a show.
He wasn't hated. Nobody shouted at him. He wasn't stoned, spat upon. No ugly placards. Nothing. And he understood then in a second that it was over.
On polling day, the 1st of May 1997, John Major voted as usual in his Huntingdon constituency. At 5 in the afternoon, he was telephoned by Conservative Central Office. The news was not good.
Things seemed to be going very badly, and the Labour Party were moving more and more of their supporters out of seats we thought were marginal into seats we thought, and it looked as though the election result was going to be a good deal worse than we had previously forecast.
John Major returned to his home, the Finings, and that evening he sat down to watch the results on television with his wife Norma and close advisers.
The mood was a very subdued mood in the house that evening. We ate fish and chips, which James Major and I went to get from the local fish and chip shop at about kind of 8 o'clock of the evening, and at 9:30, 20 to 10, we were phoned and told what the exit polls looked like, and at 10 o'clock, obviously, the election coverage programmes both started.
There it is, 10 o'clock, and we say Tony Blair is to be Prime Minister and a landslide is likely.
It was very depressing. It was very depressing because you knew a whole episode was coming to the end. And of course, as the evening unfolded, the results clearly were very bad indeed. And I sat in front of the television watching some of them with a certain air of disbelief. You see people you've known for a very long time, some very good people. People who'd been utterly loyal as well as people who'd been thoroughly disloyal, just losing their seats. And there was no distinction between the two. Whether they were good MPs or bad MPs seemed to have made that evening almost no difference to the results. And I saw people like Ian Lang and Niall Ripkind and Tony Newton all swept out of office.
I think one of the greatest shocks was clearly Michael Portillo. Then John, who'd been very still and just grey, I'd say, during most of the evening. I mean, he was absolutely astounded by that. He really took him back.
John Major left the Finings and went to count in Huntingdon to hear his own result. Then at 3 in the morning he drove at speed to London to thank party workers and returned for the last time to number 10. His family followed behind.
When we were driving back to London, my car outstripped those immediately following us, and we stopped by the Thames for them to catch up. And as we sat there, you could hear the sound sounds of revelry from across the Thames in our direction. And it was if you remember, it was a beautiful morning, weather-wise, a lovely day, and you could hear that sound coming across the stillness of the morning. Clearly, a morning for a new start. I thought then, and thought many times thereafter, what differently could I have done? Would it have made a difference? Would we have won? Would we have minimized the defeat? Were there other options that we could have taken? At the time, there were not many occasions where we thought we seriously had an alternative option to follow. But of course, that runs round in your mind for quite a long time as you reconsider the decisions you took and their impact.
The following morning, John Major prepared to leave Number 10. He thanked all his staff at a tearful farewell.
I think the only other thing I did was to leave a bottle of champagne upstairs for Tony and Cherie Blair. I just left a brief message which, as far as I can recall, was, "It's a great job. I hope you enjoy it." And I propped it up against the bottle and we left Downing Street.
John Major stepped out of Number 10 for the last time and set off for the Oval to indulge his passion, cricket. The massive defeat was hardly unexpected, and made more bearable by the hundreds of thousands of letters he received from well-wishers. John Major's allies say he left a country more at ease with itself. The economy was in its best shape for some time, and many of his reforms have endured to the present. Yet the Conservative civil war over Europe blighted his time in office. He fought to keep his party together, but never achieved the unity he desired. It may have been an impossible task. It was his own reputation which suffered.